So first I want to introduce James W. Partington. So Jim's been the director of Behavior and Analysts Incorporated. He's a licensed psychologist with over 40 years of experience. And I like this, that he's known for working with parents and professionals about practical, evidence-based procedures necessary for effective educational interventions. He's been a faculty member of several universities, has spoken internationally, written books, written assessment protocol for language skills. He's on the advisory board. And I'm sorry, I don't think we have any more time to introduce other people.
That's more than enough, please. That's more than enough, please.
And Dr. Nicole Rodriguez, welcome. And she's the director of the Early Intervention Program at the University of Nebraska's Medical Center, and as well as the director of the Ph.D. program in Applied Behavior Analysis, and also at the Medical Center. And she's the associate editor of the Journal of Applied Behavioral Analysis. So it's great to have Nicole here. Marcia Eckerd, she's been a licensed psychologist since 1985. She's been appointed by the state legislature of Connecticut to serve on the Autism Spectrum Advisory Council. And she's helped establish a pediatric development therapy center with Yale University. So thank you for being here, Marcia Eckerd. Stephen Shore, he's an autistic professor of special ed at Adelphi University. And I just happen to have this here. He's written a couple of books here, Autism for Dummies and Beyond the Wall. Why not? Just show it. I have it right here. Also, this other book, Ask and Tell, and he also serves on the advisory board. My name is Rob Bernstein. I wrote this book, Uniquely Normal, Tapping the Reservoir of Normalcy to Treat Autism, with 27 case stories depicting a developmental method. So it's not the ABA method, it's more of a developmental method of working with kids from 2 to 62. And my experience, like Jim's, I've been doing this for over 40 years. I've seen thousands of people on the spectrum. So I want to get back to Theresa, who will be moderating our discussion.
Thanks, Rob. Again, my name is Theresa Wrangham, and I have the pleasure to moderate this panel. I want to do just a few housekeeping announcements very quickly. While we're so privileged to have these professionals with us tonight, it's important to remember that the information you receive tonight is educational, and it's not a substitute for medical advice. This is a well-rounded and rich conversation to help you on your path to find appropriate treatments for your children, and it's just one in the series of many discussions we'll have here at US Autism Association. I'd also like to just set up for the panel, because we have a diversity of views represented here, I'm going to ask questions. Sometimes I'll pitch them to all of you. Sometimes I may direct specific to someone. Please chime in if you have something to add when I'm specifically directing to someone. And please keep your answers short so that we can answer as many questions as we possibly can in this short amount of time. Great. So with that, I'll start by saying I am the mother of an adult woman on the spectrum. And I think one of the first questions I'd like to start with, you know, I have the privilege every year, almost every year, of interviewing Temple Grandin. Now, Temple was diagnosed at a time before we had behavioral therapies. And I'm always amazed by her personal story. And I actually had the pleasure of interviewing her mom. Here we are in the midst of COVID-19. We have many parents and families that are in their homes and struggling to provide routine and support to their children. So from an ABA standpoint, since it is so nuts and bolts, talk a little bit about the overall nutshell of what ABA is and how parents might help find a routine in an ABA-based way with their children if they're not able to get to a program.
Yeah, well, this has certainly created a lot of interesting situations. I'm actually working with a major school system who's had their kids, most of them at home. And so now the teachers are having to try to teach over the internet. The parents have them. Sometimes the parents can work with their children. Sometimes they don't have the capability of doing that for a variety of reasons, whether it be, you know, economic or just environmental, or they're scared. They're scared. But I'd like to kind of start out by, if I could, just talking about ABA just a little bit, because I think there's so many misconceptions about it. I discovered behavior analysis when I was 17 when I went to college, and I've been a behavior analyst ever since, okay? So what my view of behavior analysis is the science of taking a look at behavior and what controls behavior. And out of that science came some technology we called applied behavior analysis, where we're using these techniques not only with individuals with autism, but for a wide variety of social type of causes. I'll try to keep it short. The problem that I have is that many times, many people have different views of what ABA is than what I do, okay? Because I think of ABA as being very, very expansive, if you will, in terms of how it's implemented. A lot of people have seen kids sitting at tables with a therapist saying, oh, do this. And then they get them to do this, and they give them an organically grown raisin or something, you know, and that's not my view of behavior analysis, okay? That's not my view of ABA. Of course, that has happened sometimes, and sometimes that is what you got to do to kind of get a child going, but most of the time it's much more fluid. It's much more teaching people how to interact with their children, to motivate them, to get them to want to follow some instructions so that you can get them to participate in some learning tasks. And that's why all my work has been on trying to make everything available to parents and teachers who have not been trained in behavior analysis, such that they know that they shouldn't be afraid of this. If you've got a child that's going to be taking a bath, there's all kinds of skills you can teach while you're getting to take a bath. They're going to take the bath anyhow. So can you teach them imitation skills, some labeling skills, some receptive language skills? All of that can be built into normal daily activities. I call it natural environment teaching. Part of what many parents need to do now, if they haven't already experienced this, is to get some training in that methodology. Like, how do you actually do this with your child? How do you get them to cooperate? You know, because a lot of times parents and kids have had this relationship where the parents back off and the kids don't want to do what they're being supposed to do, and parents as well, okay, I'm going to keep peace in the household here. And it's not that you got to upset them. Most of the time, it's a matter of just figuring out what it is that you can do to make them more excited about being with you and doing what you're asking them to do. And that's, I've written a whole book on that called Learning to Motivate, Motivating to Learn. I'm not trying to sell books or anything, but I just want to say I've written materials that parents can easily pick up and read about how do you get the kids to go along with you. And if you have somebody guiding you with a good curriculum in terms of what the child needs to learn that's going to be useful for them now, so that if they learn the skill, they use it, it'll be maintained by their natural environment interactions with others, teaching them practical skills, you know, teaching them to label the things, for instance, that are in the bathroom when you're taking a bath. It's a towel, this is the mirror, this is the tub. Taking a look at the targets. And that's why I say when you look at ABA, a lot of times people have seen one or two examples and they either like it or they don't like it. And I'll tell you this, I saw a videotape of somebody working with a kid last week, and I about died when I saw it. I said, I would fire that person on the spot, okay? Because they had no way of really interacting with the child to make it fun. I always say, you want the children to run to you, not from you. And if they're not running to you to interact with you, while you're trying to teach them, you're doing something wrong. So that's my kind of introduction to ABA, and I'll cut it at that. Okay, let others speak.
Right, and I see Dr. Rodriguez, you're nodding your head a lot. Do you want to add to that from your perspective?
Yeah, so I think your question was about kind of sort of how are families that are dealing with COVID supposed to, in the absence of being able to receive direct services, how are they supposed to handle things? Well, I think one of the nice things about everyone's response to COVID is that everyone's kind of in the midst of everything tried to really jump in and figure out how to work within the model, right? So we've been able to do more telehealth. We've been able to modify things in that ways. And what we've tried to do earlier on in COVID, especially when we had to like lock down and we weren't able to see any clients face to face, is that we've had to look back at, okay, what are the different types of things that we can be focusing on within the telehealth model? And really a lot of that is, what are we giving the parents the tools to be able to do so that they can do a lot of what Dr. Partington is saying is be part of the teachers themselves. How can they take advantage of the natural teaching opportunities? What are the goals that they need to be working on with these kids that we can focus on within this telehealth model? Because we are working in a different setting, in a different type of environment where really we're coaching the parent along the way. And for us, it's really been nice what I've seen in our clinic in the beginning of COVID. You know, I always try to look at the silver lining of COVID and what it handed us. And I always brought up the silver lining. And one of the silver linings is that it gave us more opportunity to work with parents, right? So it gave us, parents were more available. Unfortunately, given the circumstances, they were more available. I know it's not a great thing, but we were able to communicate more in circumstances that previously we weren't able to because there was like scheduling issues or whatever might be the case. And so they were more available and they were more motivated to like, oh my gosh, let's do this. And so I think it was really nice in the opportunity of like, we were able to take advantage of that telehealth model and really work with parents on trying to help them figure out how to be teachers and how to kind of take advantage of these natural teaching opportunities, how to set occasion for these learning opportunities, to advance language, to work on things that they've just been struggling with in terms of problem behavior or whatever it might be. So I kind of think in the case of COVID, when there has been cases where we've had to separate, we've kind of tried to look at it as an opportunity of like, okay, how can we shift our model and take advantage of things that previously we might have had trouble doing because we are all very busy. Parents are busy. Now we have this FaceTime. Let's do this. Let's really take advantage of this.
And I want to add in just one thing quickly. I've always said, and I've always seen, that the children who do the best from therapeutic interventions are the ones whose parents are actively involved and participating, aware of what the training programs are, and actively participating in it. Those are the kids who do the best, okay, flat out. Okay.
Well, actually, I know that, and I'm going to jump over here to Stephen because he can probably add to that, but my daughter receives special ed services, and I heard that quite often from every coordinator or every special ed teacher, that the kids who most often succeed have very involved parents, and that you really do have to have more of a team approach. Yeah. So with that, I'm going to turn to Stephen. You're a self-advocate. Was ABA around for you, and you work with children. You're in with it. So what would be your perspective of meeting children where they're at and your own personal experience with this?
So the importance of involved parents who are on the same wavelength is vitally important, so that what is done in a therapeutic session is generalized to the home and vice versa. What my parents did with me wasn't typical ABA, or what most people think of as ABA. So back to Jim. Most people think ABA is sitting at a desk, touch nose, point to blue, look at me, get a Skittle. And you end up with a very fat kid. And if that's what ABA is, then it's pretty horrible. That's not what it is. There's a lot more to it than that. From what I see, the problem with ABA is that a lot of it's practiced badly. And I think that's part of what gives it a bad name. That said, I know a number of autistic people who have been traumatized by ABA and then overgeneralize that, perhaps overgeneralize it to all of ABA. Whereas what they experienced was badly administered ABA. Now that said, what my parents did, probably in today's terminology, it would be called an intensive home-based program, emphasizing music, movement, sensory integration,
Mm-hmm.
So really, it was just parents trying to figure out how to reach their kid. And so what did they do? They tried to get me to imitate them. And that's a common strategy. Everybody uses it. I see a lot of it used in ABA, and I see a lot of it used in every other approach as well. However, perhaps due to a difference in mirror neurons, it can be hard for us to imitate, especially at the younger ages. So my parents flipped it around and imitated me. So if I flapped, they flapped. If I made some kind of sound, they made some kind of sound. And in doing so, I became aware of them in my environment. And then they were able to move me along. It probably looked more like one of the developmental approaches we have today. So does that mean ABA is trash and we should throw it out? Jim, you have to shake your head no.
I think we'll have more than Jim shaking his head no. But
Well, I'm doing it unconsciously. ABA has been one of the most documented effective ways of helping children move along, develop many skills. ABA has been very effective. Again, I cringe when, I hear you start talking about how it's practiced badly, because quite frankly, I do too, okay? Because it has a bad connotation for my field, which is so darn effective, which we have so many things to offer people if they know how to do it right. But again, many of the times when I'm out speaking at conferences, I'll ask people in the audience, I'll say, how many of you are still doing this? And I get, almost 3/4 of the hands go up, and I say, well, that's really stupid. Why are you doing it that way? And they'll say, because that's how I was taught. And well, who taught you? Well, the person who was taught by this person. A lot of bad rules out there,
Oh, yeah.
I just wanted to jump in and I see Dr. Eckhart has something to say, and I wanted to share just from a parent perspective. While I understand this and I shared some of that, I think because ABA is the oldest probably treatment around that's so well documented, it also takes the bigger hit.
Oh, yeah.
But I had my daughter in other treatments and have observed more rigidity and not meeting the child where they're at. And yet, as I learn more about so many different opportunities for treatment for our children, it really comes down to the skill of your therapist, in my opinion, and meeting your child where they're at, whether it's ABA or RDI or so many of the other therapies that are available to us now as parents. Dr. Eckerd, I'm wondering what your thoughts are.
Well, I was just going to follow up on what Stephen was saying, because I think that coming at it from just from a different perspective, I think that instead of sort of, well, how are we getting the child motivated and, to do what we want, is meeting the child and sort of following the child. Because I think one of the things that's so common for people on the spectrum is that they just don't get validated as people. In other words, there's all the things that they should be doing if they were okay. But I think one of the lovely things about this is an opportunity for parents to really follow their kids' experience and engage in it, kind of, Stephen, like your parents did. And that really develops relationship, and it develops a lot of the skills that we're talking about, but coming from the perspective of joining the child and validating the child as a person at a very young developmental level, or as we go up, the whole, and in terms of, problem solving, there's sort of want to throw in something about collaborative problem solving and Ross Green's approach, because even very young kids, and I've found very young kids on the spectrum, when you validate them and you listen to what they have to say, or they at least have the feeling you're interested in what their experience is, and then you say, wow, I really get that. And then you introduce, they really can engage in thinking or problem solving.
I think that's an important thing to keep in mind, is that ABA has been around the longest and it's the most practiced. So it has the greatest chance of garnering bad situations, which people often seem to remember more than good situations.
I kind of agree with you on that too. And also, with Dr. Eckerd there, you know, I wouldn't necessarily talk about like validating the kids, whatever that, but what I would talk about is I watch them to see what's of interest to them. If I want to find out what motivates somebody, you know, I watch what they're doing, and their behavior will tell me what's of interest to them, what's not of interest to them. And if I can come in and start offering some alternatives, kind of slightly tangent off of what they're interested, I might be able to really get them interested in, as you said, getting to go along with you then and participating. So that's my idea of motivation, as opposed to, okay, we've got these reinforcers, here they are, and this is what they're going to be. You know, that's old school. That's really old school.
Just with that, Jim, in terms of interest and the natural environment teaching and what Nicole said, natural teaching opportunities, I want to share with you what an experience I did with a kid with virtually no language. Her interest, she waters with this, she waters my plant here every day. So what do? I use this natural environment, as we all learned naturally. So I'm trying to set up a natural environment for her so the language comes from her, not from me. And so I have no water in it this time. And she's looking and she's looking. And what do I say? I've done this, you know, as you would do in your talks, Jim, many times. I ask hundreds of people and they say, you know, I ask them, what do I say as a parent or a teacher or a therapist? And they say, oh, do you want water? You know, should we get water? Does it need water?
You give the answer, right. Yeah.
And what is, right. So what I did was nothing. I want to see if the language is going to come up, you know, that my subtitle, tapping the reservoir of normalcy, I believe it. There's something within that I want to surface. So she looks at this and she says, I'm talking about like 30 seconds, right? She says, empty. The mother, just almost fainted. Empty. It's not one of the first right words of the speech therapist, you know, the most common words that people say. She says empty. So this was one of her first words, connecting to language with affect, with emotion. And from there on in, she really started to speak more because she understood the connection between her needs, herself, and language. So
really interesting and inspirational, and it actually leads me to a different question I was going to ask later, but we'll segue into it. You've all dealt with children, and as a parent, I think it's important to be inspired. And I'm just wondering if you could share, much as Rob did, a more personal story around working with a child, maybe that breakthrough moment. And I think it's just inspirational to hear around how that motivated language. Do you have a story that comes to mind that just kind of blows you away, that you got to witness with a family around some of your work, and you just saw this amazing breakthrough?
All right, so my experience is I was called to do a consultation in Los Angeles for a middle school student who spoke minimally. He had very few words, barely any words. Jim mentioned you like to observe the child, you want to see what they're interested in. What are the motivators? What are the reinforcers? And so anyways, I cheated a little bit because they told me what it was. And my observation confirmed that. And that was, this kid liked to draw. And boy, did he like to draw. And that's what he did all day, is he would draw. And they were pretty artful drawings, actually, abstract, but nonetheless artful. There was some drawings that he had done, that he had made, that were hanging around the house. And that's kind of all he did. He would sit at a table and just draw. And the parents were figuring out, well, how can I reach this kid? How can I reach our child? How can we develop communication, social interaction, and all those other things that we look towards? And the teachers had pretty much given up on him. He was in an inclusive situation, which I call geographical inclusion, because while he was in the same room as everybody else, he was just in the back drawing. because woe be unto anybody who would dare to take away his drawing materials and have him earn them back. They could get through one cycle, and that was as far as it could go. All right, let's do this. Okay, break time, time to draw. Okay, time to put drawing away. Let's go back to our work, and they could never get back to the work. So you'd only get one cycle. So I approached it a little bit sideways. And instead of working against this particular interest, I decided let's work with the interest. And I sat down at the table he was sitting at, across the table. There he was drawing on a big piece of newsprint or whatever, a huge piece of paper. And he was going at it. And I figured, well, I might as well sit down and I'm going to go at it too, and I'm going to draw, just like he is. And there was a pile of crayons, so I just grabbed a crayon and started drawing shapes. And he kind of looked at me, gave me this look, almost as if, well, what do you think you're doing? And then he went back to work. And I found that I could actually edge my drawings right up to his drawings. And there were even parts of his drawings that needed to be filled in, or at least I thought they needed to be filled in. So I'd reach over and I'd fill them in. And he was okay with that. That didn't seem to bother him. Well, how much communication does this kid have? So I held up a crayon. What color is this? He said green. He was right. I held up a bunch of other colors and he identified them. All right, at least he knows his colors and he can say his colors. Now, what if I asked him to pick up a color and use it? Pick up red crayon. Mm-hmm. He would pick it up and he'd use it. I could also hold up a crayon, ask him the color, give it to him, and then he'd take it. I could even ask him to pick up a crayon of a certain color and give it to me so that I could use it. And that was all the time I had for him. But it became clear to me that instead of working against his interests, let's accept this interest. Maybe we don't understand it, but it is there. It doesn't seem to be harmful. And let's work with the interest. And in that way, we could open the door to communication, could open the door to teaching, categorization by colors, counting, giving crayons to other people, accepting crayons from other people, and just taking it as far as it could go. So it was kind of going at it sideways. This is a technique that I borrowed from the Miller method, which is a developmental cognitive approach. For Miller practitioners, is how does the autistic person perceive the environment and how do they think? And then go about it that way.
I had a couple thoughts that I wanted to share, and I don't want to go too off the course here. But, you know, I've sort of heard this contrast between applied behavior analysis and a developmental approach. And to me, I find that very interesting because I see them more as married. And perhaps that's for me, like, so I teach development across the lifespan to in our doctoral program. And a lot of the exercise that we do is, you know, applied behavior analysis. We're so used to hearing that as this like approach, this technology, but really a lot of the exercise that we do in my class, for example, is just how do we explain how development happens through a behavior analytic lens. And a lot of times, even like our approach, I would actually consider applied behavior analytic and developmental, because we're always considering like, what is the appropriate developmental sequence? We take away age, right? We know that age doesn't matter, so to speak. It's not a governing principle, but things happen in a sequence. Well, why do they happen in a sequence? What happens in the repertoire that makes it seem that it should happen in that sequence? What happens in the environment in terms of our change in expectations and things like that? And so even in terms of like our personal experiences was your question, like, I think, you know, I ask any of my case managers, the BCBAs that I work with, the thing that they're always most excited about is when we get a kid who didn't talk. And now all of a sudden we're getting them to talk, and we're getting them to express what they want. We're getting them to label things, all those things. But mind you, we're also collaborating with our speech department, and we're picking those approximations. And I often in my own life, I have a 2-year-old and I have a 5-year-old, and I can't help, like, I think it's so much fun to be a behavior analyst and a mom, because I can't help but always be thinking about, like, what are the things that I should be teaching my child? What are the, oh my gosh, this happens before this in a developmental sequence. And I think it helps me become a better behavior analyst. But looking at, like, when we're looking at speech and looking at the developmental approach, well, certain speech sounds are developmentally more appropriate at certain ages, and certain speech sounds are not going to arise until later at certain ages. Certain errors of speech patterns are more likely to happen at certain ages. So we shouldn't be worrying about those if they haven't reached that age, right? Like, we should be letting them engage in saying nana instead of banana, and like syllable deletion and all those things. And so I think I just wanted to, I hear this, oh, developmental approach, applied behavioral analytic approach, but I just wanted to take a second and just say, like, it's not an or, it's an and.
Yeah, I agree. I absolutely agree. You know, Steve, made some good points there in terms of behavior analysis. When you were engaging with him, you were reinforcing actually some cooperation type responses that I would call them, going along with you. And that's the first step, is, just getting somebody to go along with you without having to, force them to do it. And I think that's how many people think of behavior analysis, is forcing them to do that. And one last thing, I had a funny thing that happened in my master's program. I had behavior analysis all my life. Okay, I was in a applied behavior analysis program for a master's degree. I went over to the education department and took a course in Piaget. And the second night, the professor came and sat right in front of me when I got there, and he said, "What are you doing here? You're a behavior analyst." And I said, "Well, I want to learn about Piaget. He's got a lot to offer." And okay. And then he walked away. It's like, you're not supposed to be here. There's a wall between us. And no, there's not. In fact, if you look at my normative data that I collected on typically developing kids, I've got all these sequences very well laid out and published. So we're developmental too, okay?
Do you have something to add?
Just really quick, and that is clear to me with you, Jim, because I remember a long time ago we were at a conference looking at a video of a conference that Arnold Miller of the Miller Method had produced. I don't know if you remember that. Mm-hmm. And it was like ABA and Miller Method go head to head, okay, in a competition, and they worked with the same kid, and in the end, the Miller Method clearly won out. And your observation of that, Jim, was, well, of course, the Miller Method's going to win because they were at the correct developmental level.
Okay. I don't remember that specifically, but it's probably true, because a lot of behavior analysts are not trained in developmental psychology, or they don't have their own kids that they watch grow up to see how behaviors actually develop and skills develop.
Right.
I'm going to throw you a curveball along the age spectrum. I think all of you are probably aware that, or at least I was made aware as a parent when my daughter was diagnosed. She was diagnosed at almost 7. And that was back in 1996, 97. At that time, the thinking was, oh my goodness, you missed the boat. You didn't get any early intervention. And all the books I could get my hands on, the vision for my child was rather grim. What I've come to learn by knowing so many self-advocates, but also just saying, I don't care, my daughter, we're going to just do what we can as best we can. The list of can'ts that we got were rather long, and she's defeated all of them. Almost without exception, as Dr. Partington has helped document. here in America, we still have children, the median age of diagnosis hovers around 5. I believe it's still there, which means that they're missing that early intervention. I'm wondering what your own clinical experience is with children. What are you seeing with late diagnosis in comparison to early intervention? Because I think a lot of parents need to hear there's hope. Even though your kid may be diagnosed outside that early intervention window, it does not mean that your child cannot improve. What's your thought? What are your thoughts on late diagnosis?
Well, I actually see more of kids like that than I do the little ones, and particularly girls, because when girls are bright and if they're verbal, they often can mimic social behavior or hang out close enough to everybody else that people don't pick up on the idea that they might be on the spectrum. And so it can be, they can be 10, they can be 14 before they're diagnosed, or even older. By definition, these kids that I'm talking about, I'm not talking about developing language. But I had one kid where I was called in, and this kid had a very unusual diagnosis of being called oppositional defiant disorder, which so many of them are. And, you know, and she was seen as attention seeking and manipulative and all that kind of stuff. And so I came in to see her in class, and she was insisting on having her chair on 2 legs because she could balance her chair on 2 legs. And in this classroom, the rule was you had to have 4 legs on the floor. And this was a kid who did what, you know, she marched to her own drummer, and that was that. And, you know, so she got called a lot of things. And I sat down with her and I talked to her, and, you know, and it's sort of the first person who just didn't start out telling her, you know, you're doing the wrong thing, and just said, just tell me about balancing on 2 legs. And she said that she could do it, and she never fell down, and she was very good at it, and she couldn't understand why everybody made such a fuss about it, but it didn't, you know, but what their objections didn't make any sense to her, so she was going to do what she wanted to do. And I said, well, you know, that's really interesting, and I get it, you know, and said I really saw her point. But I said, tell me something, you know, one of the things I get about you is you're really into fair. And she said, yes, absolutely. She's very into fair. And I said, well, what do you think it would be like in class if everybody balanced on 2 legs at once? And she said, well, a lot of them would probably fall. And I said, yeah, but what would it be like in class? And she sort of, you know, thought about it and decided it would be pretty chaotic. And I said, well, do you think it would be fair if we said that only some of the kids can balance on 2 legs and some can't? And she said, well, that wouldn't be very fair. And I said, so do you think maybe that's why they have a rule that nobody can? And she thought about it and she said, yeah. And, you know, and she, and that made sense to her. Do you see what I mean? I was sort of saying, okay, you know, your notion is that this, but I don't want to go on too long, but it did have a significant effect. I mean, we're talking about breakthrough. It wasn't a breakthrough in terms of language, but it was really a breakthrough in terms of not just sort of labeling her oppositional defiant and you're not doing what I want because you are this label, but rather engaging with her and having a way to kind of work with her so I just offering that as something that was exciting for me because it really was a turnaround in the school for her.
What I really notice about all of you when you talk is whether you talk in terms of developmental or ABA, you all are talking the very same thing that I've always observed, the importance of meeting children where they're at. That is what's going to propel them, whether it's to mimic a behavior so they become aware of you or observing different things about them. And I think that's what I've learned with my own daughter. If I don't meet her where she's at, we don't have a conversation, we don't make progress. I'm going to go back to my early intervention versus late diagnosis. My daughter almost lost her language, so she wasn't that talkative person. She was disappearing and losing her language. And we were desperate to find help. And she was a late diagnosis, and we watched her grow and bloom, and she graduated from college, has a job. She currently lives on her own. In fact, Jim's AFLS program helped us identify blind spots that may or may not exist as an adult. And there aren't a lot of services for adults. To recognize where was she in her development? Was she going to live successfully on her own? So I want to kind of go back to that theme of along the spectrum of age and how people are able to progress, whether they get early intervention or not.
I think what Theresa's pointing out here for the audience that's listening to us is, having a diagnosis of autism doesn't mean you know what this person's like. I mean, you don't know how old they are, you don't know how skilled they are, you don't know what intellectual abilities they have or don't have, you don't know how well they interact with people, you don't know, it doesn't tell you much of anything. And behavior analysis, applied behavior analysis, the topic of this webinar here, is good teaching techniques. I mean, if you want to boil it down to simple everyday language, behavior analysts have developed some very, very fine teaching procedures. When used correctly, okay, not incorrectly, you can take that and use that with an individual of any age, and still it facilitates teaching them skills. I was a soccer coach for girls under 12. I really hadn't played soccer in a long time, but I actually turned out to be one of the better coaches because I just knew how to teach, okay? Because I can take a look at any situation, figure out, perhaps most of the time, what needs to be worked on to be able to give the individual the skills they need that they can use right now to keep on learning more skills, hopefully without me having to teach them everything. That's really our goal. We don't have time to teach every skill to every individual we meet, whether they be a 2 or a 3-year-old, 4 or 5-year-old, or whether they be 14 or 15. But still, if we can identify what we can teach them that would make a difference in their lives practically in terms of, taking care of themselves, interacting with others, learning to learn without us, then we have some techniques that we can use to make sure we've captured the motivation of the children, make sure we're using our teaching methods that have been documented. But yeah, Theresa, what you're saying is, it really doesn't matter what age somebody is. I mean, if I'm going to teach you something, I would be using the same type of teaching I'd be using for all of you, so for kids, but it would be at your levels.
So the lesson is early intervention, while it can be a very good thing if you can catch a child early, it doesn't mean you've missed the boat. And I think that's important for people to hear.
Everybody can learn.
I just want to make a comment about Rob's story too, though, because I think that in preparing to give a talk I gave before, I was corresponding with a young man named Ido Idar, who was non-speaking for many years, and over time it turned, and he was thought to be intellectually disabled and all kinds of things. And it turned out that he understood language perfectly well. He was not able to do the motor skills to produce language, but he was able to, but he understood language, and he had language. And once he was able to learn to communicate by first other methods and then by typing, he actually ended up in the gifted program in school and has now written 2 books. And I think one of the things that's important about Rob's example is that this little girl had language. She might have been presumed by someone to not have language or to not have, verbal knowledge. But in fact, she did, as Rob said, she didn't start with mama, she started with empty, which is actually, as someone who was trained in Piaget infinite numbers of years ago in graduate school, that's a fairly sophisticated concept that, develops through sensory motor exploration, that, empty, full, all that, above, below, all that kind of stuff. And so I just think that it's important to recognize the ability that you assumed, Rob, that could be there in that young woman, in that young little girl, and that she had it, that she had that language when you gave her the opportunity or gave her the reason to have it come from her. And so I think we're talking about different ways, but I think respecting that child and respecting her level of knowledge was so important.
I'll share with you a personal story about that was a breakthrough moment for her because she really connected to language. But what I've seen in early intervention with young kids, I've seen this dramatic growth. So I went to one of 3 people in the world who's both a neurologist and a linguist. He's my friend, Steve Strauss from Maryland. He tells me he's one of 3 in the world. I don't know if I really believe him. I said, Steve, what is going on? Everybody is right that there is, improvement in any age, but I see these levels of development. And he explained that the language part of the brain is literally physically developing up until maybe 6, maybe 7. And then that developmental process stops. Of course, you're still learning and stuff, but he's explaining that now this kid that did this with this can was 6.5. So what I'm saying, if she were 3 or 4 or 5, I might have caught her in that developmental physiological process of brain development where she might have been, excuse the expression, normalized. And that's where these leaps of development happen. So yes, everyone will agree that it is better to get kids early, and later, the way I explain it, yeah, they also improve. They improve in a different way.
Let me ask you a different question, because you have all said something that I think is important, and I think Stephen would agree. When we talk about language, I think it's 40% of people on the spectrum aren't verbal, but my background as a massage therapist taught me that we very often don't say what we mean. Body language is a language. And what I noticed about what Stephen has said and many self-advocates is by mirroring or harnessing the strengths in a child and maybe being beside them as they display them and they become aware of you, you open that door to where they want to communicate with you. You're not throwing it at them so much as you're saying, I'm willing to stand beside you and wait. And that's a different kind of communication, that body language. I'm wondering how do you work with, does body language come into it when you're doing ABA, or Stephen, when you're in the classroom? It sounds like you're reading body language and working with children where they are, whether they're verbal or not. So I'd be curious to hear about work with nonverbal children, since they make up 40% of this population, and that communication can look different. It's not necessarily oral.
I'll just say one very quick thing. Body language is essential because you could tell sometimes if a kid is really listening, if he's really connecting just by the body language. And if he is, you give him time to process, time to think. So the body language is incredibly important.
Theresa, I think you were kind of talking about how you approach children too. I kind of sensed that in terms of how, as a therapist, if I'm going to interact with a child and I'm going to be his teacher or her teacher, I want to come at that individual and make sure that they see me as a good thing coming. Okay. So body language is everything. I mean, it's, how you approach, when you approach, how can you come in and step in and make things better for them right from the start so that they see you as an asset, something that they enjoy, as opposed to something to be feared. I'm not going to just come stomping up to some kids and say, come on, we got to go to work. We got to teach you these skills, take them away from what they're doing. We want to engage them in a very positive, warm, fuzzy kind of way, if you will. As a behavior analyst, I'll say that, but that's really what it is. Approach it in a nice way, the way you would want somebody to approach you.
I was also talking about, I don't remember if you remember that self-advocate panel from a couple of years ago. I think it was a client of Marlowe's. He used a keyboard and I got to read it and it would make me cry. He obviously understood his world around him. He understood language. He was a very profound individual, and yet his body didn't work well. And I think it made it harder for him to bring across what he was trying to communicate. And I'm just wondering, how you would approach some of those challenges, or what encouragement you might give parents and maybe even practitioners, professionals on how to deal with that.
Well, I think one thing to keep in mind is the idea of presuming competence.
Oh, I love that. That's so good.
And what our goal is to remove those barriers in
Mhm.
terms of communication, be it a spoken word, be it nonverbal, or be it just that the neurology of the body doesn't work in such a way as to permit what we consider as understandable movement or body language or whatever it might be. And our goal is to observe and to find these barriers and to bring them down.
I'm going to interrupt because somebody just actually wrote a question in. When do you determine that a child should move from a language-based environment to a functional skill environment? And where do you go?
I would like to chime in on that. Language is always something that we're trying to encourage and develop all the time. Okay. Now, there's some individuals who, for whatever reason, don't go as far as we would hope that they would go in terms of being able to tell what they did over the weekend with their aunts and uncles, or what they're planning for Christmas. They may not develop those skills. Some individuals will not develop the skills to be what we call curious, to ask questions like, why are we going? When are we going? Who's going to be there? Some of those more what I would call kind of advanced level for some of the individuals, not truly really advanced, but advanced for some kids. At some point in time, if you're not getting anywhere with that, if you keep trying to go that direction and you're not getting anywhere, that doesn't mean you need to totally stop it, but the shift at that point in time most often is more fruitful if you try to do the context or the teaching of the language in the context of functional skills, teaching them to care for themselves more. Because some of these individuals are going to be dependent upon somebody else if they can't do the skills they need to be independent. So looking for that to happen, if you're going to start teaching them some functional skills, like, make their own sandwiches or dress themselves or pick their own clothes appropriate for the weather, you can still be working on some language skills while you're working on more of the functional skills. It doesn't have to be an either or, okay? It's just a shift in what are we putting most of our emphasis on. But in my book, every language skill that a person picks up makes their lives better.
Totally agree with Jim, that language never leaves. In fact, language is often the gateway to important concepts that being functional skills that what you need. The concepts of before and after, concepts of past and present, concepts of what am I doing? What's the overall purpose of what I'm doing? Instead of just putting on your clothes, hey, there's a purpose here, there's an event, there's a sequence. And language could be all part of that. So
absolutely,
I totally agree. It's not separated at all.
So it's a pivot or an and, it's a shift. Would you agree with that, Dr. Rodriguez?
Yes, I think I would agree with that. And I think also just piggybacking on something that Dr. Partington said is, language is always what we're going to focus on early on, and it's going to be a main focus because that's what gives people their ability in the long term. If we're looking at like ultimate goals, is for them to be able to communicate their wants and needs, for them to be able to self-advocate, for, to be individuals that can navigate their world and whatnot. But if we're hitting barriers upon that in over, all of our best efforts, then at some point we may shift towards some of those functional living skills. It doesn't mean we give up on that vocal language, but it means that, we need to also shift into, again, what's going to let this person be their best self, what is going to let them navigate their world better. And so at some points, autism is a huge spectrum, and it's so hard to capture that and talk about, globally things, because it is very individualized. So I think, always looking at what's going to help this person succeed in their life.
And Dr. Rodriguez, because you have a 2-year-old and a 5-year-old, I'm sure you're working on some functional skills with your kids too, aren't you? So it's not as if we totally weren't doing it before. You're doing
exactly.
it right now. Yeah.
Oh, totally. And I'm glad you said that, because that's the other point. It's anytime everyone brings up something, I'm like, I have like 10 thoughts at once and I have to navigate which one to prioritize. But I think that's the other thing that I was thinking, is that we're always working on functional living skills, right? So again, it's not an or, it's always an and maybe sometimes our focus shifts depending on various factors, but we're always working on functional living skills.
So it sounds like part of the answer is letting the child lead you. And I think Dr. Eckhart had mentioned that before, follow the child. And even Stephen had talked about that, meeting the child where they're at. Let's see, we had a question, but I wasn't sure I understood it. So I'm asking the person to reframe it for me. I'm wondering, from your perspective as analysts, I know there are 3 of you here, because ABA is, I hate to say old, but it's an older treatment. Would you say that it's evolved? Has it been flexible?
It's evolved tremendously.
Yes, 100%.
You know, in 1972, when I first started working with kids with disabilities, it was a whole different approach. It was more along the lines of what people may be looking at today. Some bad examples have been passed on for several decades, unfortunately. I've actually been very, very adamant about trying to move our field in the direction of, you know, naturalistic types of teaching. It's not, you know, we can have situations where we sit down and we may teach a specific skill at a table because it's more convenient to do so, and we can actually focus on some finer distinctions in a very short period of time that would be hard to do in the natural environment. But as I said, behavior analysis has really helped us to develop knowledge about how we teach skills and how we maintain the motivation of the learners. And putting that all together takes some expertise. You know, it's not a cookbook. And I think that's where some of the people that are doing some things that Stephen might say, hey, look, this person was doing, so yeah, I would be really upset with that too, because they don't know how to put the pieces together. A lot of people who are implementing these training programs may not have had the highest level of teaching. They may have had, you know, 40 hours worth of instruction about teaching, but you really learn about how to teach through interactions with your students, who it is you're working with, whether they be a 2-year-old or whether they be a 20-year-old. It's the, you know, you have to learn to adapt, and a good behavior analyst does a lot of the things we were talking about earlier about reading the body language. You're watching your student very carefully to see, are they maintaining their motivation? Are they interested? Are they not interested? And you're really trying to help them develop skills by capturing their motivation. And it's an art form. It's an art form.
I was wondering if Dr. Eckerd or Dr. Rodriguez had something to add.
Yeah, I guess I would just say, you know, yes, I think it is an evolution, and I think it should be an evolution. And that is, you know, applied behavior analysis is sort of a conceptual system. It's a science that allows us to be very effective and bring that to what we're doing in a very socially significant way, in a way that's supposed to be important to people, right? And what I like about our science, or the applied piece of it, is that there's a lot of practitioners, scientists, who are approaching things in very systematic ways. And when I think about research, and my own research, it's very much guided by the problems I encounter in my clinical practice. So like, oh my gosh, here's a barrier. Other people are probably experiencing the same barrier. How do we address this in a systematic way that goes based off of behavior analysis and the way that we think about it, so that we can share it with other people who are probably experiencing the same thing I'm experiencing? And I think that is helping us to evolve. I think another thing that I just want to say is that as part of this thing, I recognize that, you know, people may have had good experiences and bad experiences with applied behavior analysis, but I think that it's important to understand that what we call social validity. So is what we're doing important to people? Is what we're doing, like, the targets that we're targeting, are the procedures that we're using, do those sit well with people, like with the people who are advocating on behalf of the kids? And in my opinion, the behavior analysts are also advocates for the kids. The parents are advocates for the kids. And we all need to kind of come together and come to the table. And we need to be having those conversations frequently about, do we like the targets that we're picking? Do we like the procedures that we're using? There's almost always multiple paths to success. So we can choose different paths to success, and are we happy with outcomes? And so I think just making sure that we are having those conversations, and that's part of what we're doing as well.
Okay, and then Dr. Eckerd, did you have something you wanted to add?
Well, you know, again, I'm working with older children, but I think another piece of it, I mean, certainly I agree that, and there will be disagreement about what goals we have and whether we want to stop a STEM or not, or whatever, you know, I mean, obviously we have differences on that. But I'd like to add in that, you know, that certainly as we get a bit older, you know, language isn't just words, and understanding how someone thinks and their thought process might be different. It might not be at the same pace. It might be that someone's taking longer to process language. It might be, I mean, that's certainly something Temple Grandin talks about, but I mean, understanding how someone thinks, whether it's you're looking at the fact that they're very literal, or whether you're looking at the fact that they're going somewhere and detail by detail, and you know their way of going is different than maybe the other, you know, the other person's way, or they're not picking up on an inference. I mean, there's a whole lot when we talk about language that's so much more in terms of understanding and having a sort of a two-way conversation where you're actually working to understand each other. You really have to work at understanding how that person thinks too.
Let me see if I can phrase this question right. We touched on it a little bit. And Dr. Eckerd, you've said a couple times you work with older children. I have I think it's a mom here who, her concern seems to be, what other resources are available for older kids? How does ABA apply to that older generation? Or do you also do like a resource referral for other kids, you know, that has something to do with age?
Well, I mean, this isn't an answer, okay, because I do come from a different approach. But, you know, in terms of helping kids change behavior, sometimes the OT and the sensory approach can be so critically important. And I had one little boy I was working with, and he's sort of middle school age, and he was in a disastrous situation because when he was in his classroom and he was frustrated, and they would just keep pushing him to do what he was, no, you have to do this, and he would end up melting down and on the floor and crying and screaming and everything like that. And it took a combination of putting him in an appropriate academic environment, but also giving him some sensory tools that he could use for self-calming. It wasn't that he didn't want to, or that he had to, but he had to have literally tools to do it. And working with an OT, we figured out that going out of the room and doing wall push-ups helped him deal with his frustration enough to where he could come in, settle down, and use other tools. So I think we have to remember OTs and speech and language people, and that there's an awful lot of other people who can be providing enormously helpful input to the kids, and it's not just us.
Jim, did you have anything to add to that?
Well, obviously there's many different approaches, okay? And everybody has to be treated as an individual, so it's not a one size fits all treatment. It's a matter of what does this individual need for them to be able to live life to the fullest, okay? And how can we help them, have that happiness? As I always say, we're all of us are only here for a short period of time on this earth, whether you're typically developing or atypically developing. And we want the same thing for everybody in life, and that is to get the most out of it, to enjoy every opportunity that we can. And some of us have more opportunities than others, but certainly if you have a lot more skills, that opens up the doors for many, many more opportunities. So behavior analytic teaching methods, along with you know, good planning, good implementation, good awareness of the individual, their motivation and what's important to them and how you can capture that and, you know, turn that to kind of help them and enjoy the progress that they're obtaining, you know, enjoy them for who they are as an individual, but yet still help them try to develop as many skills as possible, like I say, so they can get the most out of life. But I think one of the other pieces too is that I've very touched by a number of parents along the way. You know, sometimes we as interventionists may come in and say, well, this is what we think ought to be, they should be working on. And then, you know, some of the parents that I've worked with before have said, you know, like, yeah, I get it. That's really, really important. But you know what I'd really like? I'd really like my son to be able to go down with my other children to the grocery store, or to the bowling alley, to the movie. And one mother I had, she said, you know, I know you're making such great progress, but, you know, could you teach them how to swim? I said, well, that's usually not on our agenda, but yeah, we know how to teach, and we can teach them how to swim too, because some of our staff here have actually taught swimming. And said, yeah, we'll do it. And this mother came back, she said, you know, I thank you every day for that, because we like to go to the swimming pool as a family, and it helps us as a family to have something to do together. And so, you know, taking a look at the different perspectives, you know, we don't have all the answers. The kids I work with, whether they be adults or kids, young kids, you know, I'm not their parent, and it's not my life. It's that parent, and it's that child or that adolescent or that adult. And we want to try to help it work for them, all of them.
Yeah. I have a question for Jim, which I would love to know. Let's say that you had a parent and her question to you was to teach the child, you know, she wanted her kid to come with the family to the bowling alley. They all like to bowl. And this kid had extreme auditory hypersensitivity. And a bowling alley is one of the noisier places there are. Not only are there people talking and lots of things going on, but there's the balls hitting there's a lot going on. I mean, would you in any way talk to that mom about whether that's the best environment for a child?
Oh, of course, I have a great discussion about that one. Say, you know, first you want to be able to do things as a family, and they may have latched onto that one as the thing that they wanted to have happen. But you might be able to then sit down and come up with some other options for them that might not have those same type of environmental noises. Because I too don't like noisy environments like that. It drives me nuts, unless it's rock and roll, in which case I love it. So, but you know, if it's this random kind of noise and stuff, and lots of people, I don't find enjoyment in that either, and I tend to avoid it. And I think, you know, Stephen and I, we've had talks about this before too. I mean, he's wearing his hat, right? And so, you know, there's ways we control our environment to make sure that it works for us. Okay, and it doesn't mean we have to force everybody into doing everything we want them to do. That's really what you have to kind of talk through.
Right.
I wanted to add something. I know as my daughter grew, when we talked about targets, a couple of you talked about targets and how to consider, is it a good target? Is it a good goal? And as my daughter aged, and I'm wondering how what Stephen's perspective is as a self-advocate, as Rachel became older, I realized I needed to be more inclusive of her. She got to set her goals. So during special ed meetings, I would start letting her handle the meeting and talk about what was important to her and how successful she felt something was, or talk about what she needed help in. What I saw was more empowerment on her part, more self-confidence, but it seems to me we need to check in with our children where we can, and also have their ability and self-direction in setting some of those goals. Stephen, I was wondering if you could, as a self-advocate, kind of talk a little bit about that, and then we could get a perspective from Rob and the practitioners.
That's just a part of working with the child, as opposed to, again, certain behaviors, you might say. And that's what we've been talking about all day. An important aspect of that is that we do what we can to educate the child what it means to them to be autistic. Because you need to know where your strengths are, and you need to know where your challenges are. And while I do advocate and practice a strength-based way of looking at supporting autistic people, we also have to recognize that there's some real challenges that come with being autistic. If there weren't, we wouldn't be here trying to figure it out. And as I said earlier, looking at these challenges as barriers that we need to tear down so that the person can be successful, so that they can advocate.
I'd love to throw something in there, though, because I think this is an incredibly important point that you're raising, Theresa, that part of the research that I did, it turned out that 77% of young adults, someone who's 17, 18 on the spectrum, did not participate in their post-secondary training, versus about 49% of those with intellectual disabilities, versus about 24% of people with any other kind of disability. And I think that this notion of whatever one is doing, to have the young person feel that they do have something to offer, and that they can participate in whatever way is possible in what they want. And I had one young man I've been working with. He was in a program where they were teaching him certain things, but he was also on his own going to college and taking courses in business communication. Nobody really was paying much attention to that. And I said to him, and I said, well, what do you want to be doing? And he said, well, I don't know, I'm autistic. And I said, well, yeah, but do you realize you're taking courses that are really hard courses? And most people your age don't want to take hard courses. They want to take it easy. And, and not knowing what you want to do when you're 20-year-old isn't autistic. That's just being 20 years old. And so what do you like? What do you find you enjoy doing? And he actually took the lead at the next meeting that they had about him and said, I'm not getting anything out of this. And I want to start getting something, that I can use. And I'm like, I was just so thrilled, but no one had ever said to him before, look at the fact that you work so much harder than anyone else is willing to, and you do these things, and you have something to offer. And the fact that 77% of these kids, when over 50% of them have average intelligence, they could be playing a bigger role if they were given the message that they can.
So some of these kids, Theresa, have to be taught to be self-advocates. It may not, it's nice to have it.
Absolutely. That's such a good point, Rob. Go ahead.
I'm going to share you, I guess, a tragic. I never used the word tragic when I tell this story, but it feels tragic. And I don't think that's an exaggeration, that a kid comes to me and says, I need help. He's coming to me with a problem with the Pythagorean theorem. He's coming to me. So I'm working with him. But he's in a class for the intellectually disabled. And what happened was that he couldn't do his work. He couldn't do the, what he needed to do. And I learned this in graduate school. You kind of lower the bar and you lower the bar and you lower the bar until he can get to that baseline, right? But he wound up going into an intellectually disabled class, and he's screaming, I don't belong in this class. He wants to take the SATs. So this has been going on for 4 years. This case went to a hearing. So I asked him something, and I know this for a fact, that nobody asked him for 4 years. I think, Jim, you're going to appreciate this. I asked him, what's going on? Because he didn't, I should have tell you this, he didn't really get what I was teaching about the Pythagorean. He didn't get it, he didn't get it. So I asked him, why? What's going on in your mind? So in other words, he never had the ability for 4 years to advocate for himself. So I asked him why, and he told me why. He said, I have these interfering thoughts when I'm doing this problem. I said, wow, would it be a good idea to get those interfering thoughts kind of calmed down? He said, that would be great. So I got a yoga person to come in, and she did it, and he was like, great, it was wonderful. But the point is, he wasn't even aware for 4 years that he needed to advocate for himself, to tell people what he needed.
Well, I wonder if sometimes we forget to ask what our children need, or I asked for myself as a parent. What I started to realize is I made assumptions, and I felt like at a certain age, you risk your child saying, God, I don't want to do that. I'm done being I'm done with therapies. And we met a wall with speech therapy with my daughter. We did speech therapy forever, and she didn't want to do it anymore. So that's when I realized we had to sit down and talk about what she wanted. While we all wanted her to progress, I needed her buy-in, and I realized I hadn't given her a voice to tell me what mattered to her. What did she want? And she was just tired. She wanted a break. So we took a huge break, and we did it at her behest. And then we started regrouping and saying, what do you want? What's important to you? Where do you want to go? Let's talk about it. And it was really kind of amazing to realize after spending all that money on creating conversation, I wasn't having one. So with my daughter, I was having it with her therapist. So I see Jim nodding. Did you have?
Well, if I might, I mean, when she was about 20, 21 years old, I had the most delightful conversation with her at a dinner, okay? And she was just an absolute delight, okay? Sharing experiences, inquisitive and everything else. So yeah, she's come a long, long way. But I think, the point you're trying to make, Theresa, is very valid. And that is, we don't make all the decisions. And certainly for other individuals, we want to give them more and more control over their own life because it is their life. It's not for us to tell them what they should be or what they should be doing, but rather take a look at what's important to them. And I have a niece that's on the spectrum, and I've kind of helped along the way with educational programming, shall we say, the school systems, helping her get the right programming. She's very smart, graduated from high school, full diploma and everything else. She's actually living independently with a little bit of support. But it was interesting because when I'd watch other professionals who are trying to do, the yearly planning for them, the life plan, whatever, they would say, well, she's not travel trained. She can't take a bus to this place or walk to these different places by herself. And my niece is scared to death about getting lost, okay? And so I said, hey, if you don't want to work on it, tell them, I don't want to work on this. So, you can arrange for a bus to take you from here to there. You can arrange for a friend to take you from here to there. And that just eased up everything, But I said, what would you like to learn? What would be important to you? And then from there, you start making a plan where she's actually telling us what's going to make the biggest difference in her life to get the most enjoyment out of it, rather than us saying, you really need to be able to go different places by yourself. That's not right. It's her life, not ours. And so I think being able to really ask those types of questions so that they can kind of tell us what's important and what, may be interfering, or as some people have said, different things that are getting in the way of them being successful. We really have to explore that, not just come in and say, we're the experts, you need to listen to us. No, it's not true.
Okay. I hate to tell you this, it is almost 7:30, and I'm going to do what Stephen and Jim will recognize as the lightning round. If there was one thing, this is the Miss America question, by the way. If there was one thing that you wanted parents to walk away with tonight around ABA, the one thing you wanted them to walk away knowing, what would that one thing be?
I'll start because I don't think the answer is going to be much different between ABA and this developmental idea. And that is, and it's coming from what Jim just said, respect. And respect to me means seeing the situation from the other kid's point of view. That's what's key. If a kid really wants a brownie and he feels he deserves it because he made him in his class, and on the way to the brownie, an assistant gets in the way and he gets pushed, and he gets suspended for 3 days. And I go to this meeting with, the 8 people there, the principal, and I said, wait a second, just look at it from the kid's point of view. He made the brownies, he wants the brownies. I mean, just at least recognize his point of view. I'm not saying pushing is good or bad, right? It's bad, but just recognize it from his point of view, please. And I think that's the one message that I'll give. Just look at the situation from the other person's point of view.
Stephen?
And to amplify that, What that means is working to develop a good theory of mind for autistic people. Often theory of mind is conceived of as autistic people not understanding the non-autistic mind. But then we can also ask how many people who aren't autistic have difficulty understanding the autistic mind. So I think if we all work better to understand each other, then we'll be much better off.
Dr. Rodriguez.
Yeah, I mean, I think I kind of want to be mindful of the fact that this is a spectrum, right? And we're dealing with a lot of variability in the skills, and we talked a lot about meeting kids where they're at. And sometimes we're working on building skills and doing so in a systematic way, and there's these building blocks. And I think what I want parents to walk away with is to be part of the process. We should be talking about the goals together, and to weigh in on what's important for you and your family, but also to have a conversation. So if a behavior analyst comes to the table with, oh, we should be working on X goal, well, why? What is that in the big picture? What does that mean in the big picture? Have that conversation, be part of developing those goals. And if you have any questions, ask what the bigger picture is, question it. If you don't know, like if you're like, I don't think this is important, tell them. And then they can either tell you why it's important or say, you know what, you're probably right. Maybe what else should we be working on? What's important to you? What are you struggling with in your daily life? And then I would also just encourage the more people in your child's environment that can be part of these discussions, the better. So I always want to push our relationship with the schools in a very back and forth. What are you struggling with that we can help you work on?
Team communication.
Yeah, it's that communication and bringing everyone to the table, because the more people that you can have involved in the process, and the more that we can all be working towards the same goals. And then I do think that we should have people questioning, why is this important, and having that conversation.
Wonderful. Thanks. Dr. Eckerd.
I'd like to echo both Rob and Stephen. I think that understanding the child's world in all of its dimensions, sensory, motor, language, cognitive processing, everything, to try to make sense of it from the child's point of view. And as I'm taking, Stephen, what you said one step further, I think, in that the burden is often on the child to have to explain this instead of for us to try to understand it with the child. And so, meeting the child, and then the other thing that was said before is presuming competence. That this may make more sense if we go, as Rob just said, into the child's perspective.
Thank you. And Dr. Partington?
I just want to say I've enjoyed this panel discussion here. There's a lot of good points here. And, there's so many different issues that we're talking about here, from younger kids to older kids, who are, more competent in being able to, discuss issues about themselves perhaps and play more of a role. My message, I think, is that I'd kind of like people to walk away with is, parents, I'm hoping there's lots of parents out here watching, but, parents, when you have a child, you become a teacher, whether you want to or not, okay? And whether they're typically developing or not developing the way you would expected them to develop, or were hoping that they were developing, but they're still an individual and you are their parent. And the more you learn about effective teaching, about how to capture the motivation, how to make it fun for your child, how to teach as you're doing all kinds of daily activities. There's so much that is in the literature of behavior analysis that is there for the taking. I know it's really difficult, though, a lot of times to get access to that. But if you can get a competent provider who can help guide you and teach you how to teach, and teach you how to watch for the motivation of the child. What are they interested? Look, they're losing their motivation. You got to switch to something else now. You can't just keep going and hope they're going to keep going with you. There's so many elements of successful teaching that you need to learn, that I encourage you to, reach out for those resources, whether they be individuals or books, or just people who are good teachers. And there are a lot of good teachers who are not behavior analysts, okay? Now, they would say they're not a behavior analyst, but they're using good behavioral teaching methods when they're working with them. So you got to be really careful. Some grandmas are really excellent teachers, and they could really do well, not explaining behavior analytic terms, but in teaching. So again, it's being effective and being sensitive to your child in terms of what their needs are, what their interests are, capturing those and help guide them to learn new skills, take care of themselves, learn functional skills from an early age, and of course, develop language skills. And one last thing I want to say, it's been hit a number of times, but I can't emphasize this enough, and that is the role of imitation, developing a child's ability to pay attention to what you're doing and how you're doing it and being able to replicate that is huge for learning so many different skills. And I think one of the skills that's often under-taught in many programs is developing a good imitative repertoire for children, because it goes a long way in getting them focusing. But make it fun. This is their life. Let's let them enjoy it, and let's try to make it as, them as successful as possible in being able to learn skills on their own.
And I just want to say thanks to everyone tonight, and I guess it's good night. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Theresa. I want to make a special thank you for Marlo Payne Thurman and Jennifer Grace, who hosted. So I just want to make sure everybody gets thanked.
Thanks for remembering that. Well, good night, everyone.